each time you think you've got it conquered, then there's a new one in front of you, right? I think that, as leaders in Ontario today, we certainly struggle with competing priorities, and a lot of it is community priorities, right? Sometimes, and this is a part of one of the things that I struggle with, is the competing priority of creating well-being conditions as well as focusing on the core business of teaching literacy, numeracy, and learning, really, right? Because a lot of times those two conversations are situated as an or, and it's really difficult to help people to understand. And the way I put it is it's necessary but not sufficient, right? So, welcoming spaces, humanization of curriculum, well-being and mental health are necessary, but they're not sufficient to preparing young people to enter a world where they're able to author their own lives.
I would say I'm pretty biased in terms of what I look for in other leaders. Is this somebody that I aspire to or find to be a good leader? And I would say the two things are the degree to which that leader laughs and has a playful spirit about them, which is not always easy to find, but you can see that. And then the second one is how they interact with those that they are serving. Today's guest, Camille Williams-Taylor, checks the box on those two things. So first of all, Camille is just an easy person to talk to. And as you'll find out in our interview today, we laughed a lot together, and she's a delightful person and sets you at ease with her perspective on things, vulnerability, a little bit like humility, those kind of things. That's appealing. And again, her ability to laugh. And secondly, as I said, I got to watch her in action at a session I did about a month ago in her district, where I just watched her listen to her team talk. And as much as others might be waiting for her to interject or sort of take the reins, she didn't do that very often. She was very thoughtful in listening to what other people had to say. And so those are, I think, two character traits that I just find very appealing. And again, as we even mentioned in the podcast, that the book, The 9 Lies About Work, one of them is that leadership is a thing. In other words, that you can define what great leadership is, and it looks different in different places. But that said, I do have a personal bias towards things that I look for in leaders, and Camille Williams-Taylor meets that criteria. And so we had a really great conversation. It's been a treat to get to know her journey as a Black woman in educational leadership has its own challenges, and she shares some of those. And so you get a little insight on that. She also talks about her time in Manitoba, then in Ontario, and kind of the differences there, and then just her trajectory as a leader and as a mother as well. She shares lots of insights just as being a mom and a parent. So great conversation today. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Camille Williams-Taylor, Director of Education in Durham District School Board in Ontario. So Camille, we were just talking, and I said, don't give me your answer yet, because I actually want to get this as a recording as opposed to a casual conversation. So you asked me how I was doing. I told you this little story about the things that I'm juggling.
Right.
And it made me wonder, as a leader, how has your time management skills improved or evolved in your years as a leader?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would use the word evolve because, of course, a lot depends on the role you have and what it is you're undertaking. I have an active family, and I started in, more formal leadership when my children were quite small. So,
Right.
tell the story that when I was first a vice principal, permanent vice principal, that I actually left one of the school council meetings, community council meeting in September, and went home and had the baby. So that that's the story that I mean, it's the truth, because I didn't quite know. I hadn't had a baby before, so I didn't know what was kind of happening. I didn't feel so good. And so that's an example of time management, button everything right up to the last possible moment. But a part of it too is using all the time, right? So
Yeah.
it's been learned over, years and years of where it is that I can I have flexibility and where it is that I have some non-negotiables, right? So I have never found myself to be that person that sets a lot of inflexible, this ends at this time and this starts at this time, because I simply wouldn't be able to, by just queuing people think things up one after and the other, I'd never be able to finish everything. But being able to work in between, overlap things. I was the dance mom who would be, waiting in the reception area with my laptop, right? So having things overlap is one of the strategies that I've used and continue to use. And I would say it's as rudimentary as it sounds. I make lots of lists. Like
Yeah.
I make lists at work, I make lists at home, just because some of the things I know I can parse off. So where other people can do things, I ask them to do it. I'm the mother of twins, so I have no reservation about accepting help.
Mm.
And then the other thing is managing the expectations, right? There's some things that I would have liked to have done on a weekend, but
Right.
I didn't get to it this weekend. So it'll have to be next weekend unless somebody else wants to take it on. So from a time management point of view, I said to a group the other day when I was presenting that it's not a question of balance, it's a question of integration. So
Right. Yeah. Well, and I guess the other question that I think about is as we have over the years elevated, the mental health and well-being, you as a leader, listen, I know your job. I know enough about what's on your plate to know, like, you've got 100-hour work week easy
right,
if you wanted it to be.
right.
So what do you think is your role, responsibility, if any, in modeling? What does it look like? Because you have a job that's not an easy thing to show or
Right.
model or demonstrate. Are there things that you think about in terms of how can I kind of lead in this work for those that I serve, that so that they know that, I don't know, it means you have to end the meeting to go have a baby. I like that may not have been your best
That's not the
modeling.
ideal situation. I'm not sure.
But maybe there's something else
Critical.
that you consciously think about in terms of sending the message that, yes, this work's important. Yes, this work is exhausting, but you also have children and life and family
Right.
outside of this that takes priorities too.
And I think that the modeling of it is the recognition of that life that is outside of work. And, I know in one of my newsletters, for example, to the staff, it was fall and I talked about loving walking my beagle. And walking a beagle is quite an undertaking if you know anything about beagles. Um,
We had a pug back in the day, and it was
yeah,
like,
so
yeah,
there you
that's a
go.
whole thing.
But then people, and it's interesting because I work and live in the same community. And so there are people that see me about with the beagle. So, those kinds of personalizations help people to realize that you bring your whole self into
Yeah.
the work you do. But similarly, it's particularly when you are engaged in work you love, you bring the work you do home to the people you love. So having those, I do tell the stories of those experiences. And I also tell the stories of the things that I learn by integrating in that way. So what kinds of lessons do I learn at my kitchen table? What kinds of things do I
Right.
share with folks around, the fact that sometimes it's not through the book that I read. And I do talk about the books that I read and the things that I watch. And just as a matter of modeling for my senior staff and encouraging those stories to be a part of their leadership, because it's those stories that make us whole people, right?
Yeah. One of my favorite sayings is a colleague that says, one of the best things you can do for your students, he's talking about, is to be an interesting person.
Right.
That's really, you're right. Which means, yeah, I don't just do this all day
Yeah, I don't
long.
turn
I
it
do
into a
other
book and go on a
things.
shelf at 3 o'clock, right?
Right, right. Now, I have one more question to ask you that wasn't in the questions I sent you. And that was when we were together a couple of weeks ago, I'm watching you engage in that day of work. And you had, and I wanted to take a picture of it, a very beautiful notebook that I don't know if you call it sketch noting,
Yeah.
because that's what you did. Like, you do this really. So I'm curious about where that development came from, how you sort of evolve with that, but also too, how you see that as being a really important way of you kind of not just staying engaged, but then having a reference of experiences and meetings and things you've attended to.
So it's interesting because you saw me with the big book because when I became a director, those little 8 by 10 books that you used to get at chapters just weren't cutting it for me. And so I found these larger books and then, I just started to order them and use those all the time. So I actually probably have about, I don't know, 30 of them because it's almost how I document my thinking. So the team, they joke, right? Because we get into a discussion about something or we're learning something, and then I open my book and everybody goes, "Oh, she's going to draw a picture." Right? Because that's how I kind of synthesize, is to look at how things overlap, how they integrate. I I learned later that it was called sketchnoting because I started to
Okay.
do it and then found out that it's actually a researched thing. And it was a school that I was in Ottawa that I was visiting, and the principal actually undertook that as a lesson to share with students. For people who are neurodivergent, they have different ways of making what they're hearing come to some kind of understanding in their mind. And so I find it, I am able to kind of create those pictures and synergies and organize them in a page so that the note actually is one page rather than just reams and reams of writing that you go through. And it causes you to really sift out the things that jump out at you and the way they look in your mind, when you put them down. So I have found that I've gone back to some of my sketch notes because I remember, yeah, I divided that page into six that time. And this was on the top left corner.
Mm,
And so,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
being able to access the thoughts easily. So that's where that kind of came from. And I learned a little bit more about it, but there's a confidence when you don't have to show it to anybody. It's only for you, right? So it doesn't, the tree doesn't have to be perfect and, it doesn't have to be perfectly
It
balanced.
looked pretty good to me, I would just say that. And in fact, I'm gonna ask if you feel comfortable going back to those notes. If you would just take a picture of one page, just so
Sure.
people can get a sense of. So if you would do that'd be great. Plus, it would give people who are listening a reason to maybe watch the video.
Okay.
So do you, when you said, you can access things because it was in the left corner. So it reminds me of something that my wife's fascinated with, something called synesthesia. Do you know what synesthesia
No,
is?
I don't.
So I mean, you may or may not have it. So it's where people have a visual reference for numbers, letters, those kind of things. So she says I have it in the sense that when I think of time and a calendar, I see it not in a normal way, but I visualize what that looks like. And she has no concept of what that is.
Right.
But I know people who have, I have my granddaughter has genders for numbers.
Right. Right.
There's a connection anyway, you can look it up. It's fun
That's
research.
interesting.
It takes
Synesthesia?
time. Synesthesia, it's called. Yeah. So it's kind of a niche thing that people sometimes like to talk about it
Okay.
and connect with other people. My sister's got it in a weird way, but my wife's very disappointed she doesn't have it. So anyway, but she knows more about it than anybody.
Okay.
All right. Anyway. All right. So that's 10 minutes of not the questions that I wanted to ask you, but I enjoyed them. So I look at your journey. One of the things I was going to ask you about is, so I didn't realize you had a Manitoba connection. So I'm always curious, and part of the show is to help people understand the Canadian context beyond their world, their province, their board, whatever. So I'd love for you just to maybe high level kind of your experience in Manitoba lined up against Ontario. And again, I know there's more things are alike than different. That's always true. But just in terms of what you noticed that were a change from your time in Manitoba and now your time in Ontario.
Well, I don't know if the change is just geography because, of course, I was
No.
in a different time of my life then. And so I started teaching in Winnipeg because my adolescent and undergraduate life was there. So I came to Canada when I was probably 13, 14 and was junior high school and then did my undergraduate at University of Manitoba. So I had that kind of grounding and I went away and did some other things, including my teacher's college. And I came back home to start teaching, which was Winnipeg. And I taught in an inner city. And so, people think of Winnipeg and it's, if you don't know Winnipeg, you don't realize that there's an inner city to Winnipeg. And so,
I grew up an hour south of Winnipeg, so I'm very
okay, so
familiar.
there's an inner city. So it was Ellis
Yeah,
Avenue was
100%.
on the school where the school was. And it was an amazing experience. And, I taught there for 2 years. But again, being a person of color and Winnipeg at that time, there wasn't a lot in terms of a community that I saw. And, a lot of us, young people of color, we really, a lot of us would talk about the big city. We'll get to Toronto because, so many of our Caribbean communities were represented here. So that was always something that I wanted to do. And I spoke French. So I lived in a French community in New Brunswick for a year. And so, developed my French to the point where I was capable of teaching it. So if you're a French teacher, you have a job pretty well.
Yeah.
That's how I ended up in Ontario. And so I started teaching at Peel, and I taught in the old city of York, former city of York, which ultimately became a part of Toronto District School Board, came to Durham, being out in Ottawa in leadership. So having had lots of different kinds of experiences, I wouldn't say to you that there's some vast difference between being in Winnipeg and being in Toronto, outside of course, the obvious size. But I think that because my community really professionally is education, it turns out that, that's where the synergy is. And so it's really interesting coming full circle now that one of the directors of education, that he's now retired, but was in Manitoba in Winnipeg, was a guy who was 2 years ahead of me in my high school. And so, and some of the people that because the education circles, they overlap each other, I find myself kind of reconnecting with people who know people. So it's been an interesting journey because all of it just showed up. And one of the things, when I do, and I think it's an answer to one of your questions here, is the whole idea of pay attention and show up, right? Like I found out about a job fair, by walking through the Faculty of Education lounge at the University of Manitoba when I was doing a postgrad credit, and saw a sign, Ontario Job Fair. So I polished up my resume and I put on a red suit and I came and did the interview. And, pay attention and show up, and things show up for you. So it's kind of how I got here.
Yeah, and kind of building on that, I'm curious, I mean, there's no other province, at least in my recollection. I know a handful of people of color in other provinces, but Ontario is really, I think, as far as the leadership side of it goes, kind of paid attention to that in some degree.
Right.
So just even as a Black, not just as a person of color, but as a female in the system, you see kind of things in a different light. So I'd love just to kind of hear that, how you think the trajectory has been when, you talked about being in Manitoba, being, pretty much a minority. There just weren't other folks like you there.
Right.
And sort of how that trajectory has gone, both in terms of, that community itself growing, but
Right.
also the ways in which that's been better, worse, or different over the years from that lens.
Well, my identity as a Black woman certainly always informed my teaching, because even as a teacher in Winnipeg, and that there was not a large community, I remember there was a large community of immigrant students in my classrooms, right? So I had a significant population of Filipino students in the inner city area, some Black kids. And then additionally, besides the immigrant community, I also learned about Indigenous communities as well, which is not something I learned growing up, but when I was in the inner city, I did. And so coming over to Ontario, I always worked in communities and in schools where there was a significant population of whether it's either immigrant or Black students. And it was really interesting and important for me around how it is that I took the lessons learned as a kid who felt isolated to what kinds of classrooms I was going to create for my students. What were the things that I just implicitly understood? And what were the things that I wanted them to see differently, from the point of view that certainly you may see things in this way, but here's what it could look like if you wanted it to look like that, right?
Right.
So even
Right.
things like, later on in my professional life, going from straightening my hair to wearing my hair naturally curly, it turned out that it was actually an inspiration to some women who
Yeah.
didn't feel that they could do that in a professional space, right? And
And did you feel when you were straightening your hair, was there part of you doing it to conform?
absolutely,
Okay.
because the
Yeah.
question was,
So you didn't, you
what's
just
all
didn't,
of
you were
this?
saying
It's
there
so
was a
big.
time. Yeah. But you're saying there's a time where you didn't feel that you could wear the way you're wearing your hair right now.
No.
Like that would have not gone over
And I
well.
will tell you that where I started to do that was when I taught at the faculty. I taught at the Faculty of Education at York U, and the young Black women who were coming up through, they were doing that. They were wearing their, and I thought to myself, why am I not doing that? And so I had to ask them lots of questions, right? But how was I going to do that? But it wasn't something that was in our psyche. Like we were really taught
Yeah,
that you had to look a certain way.
that's right.
And I think that, being able to be who you are, and now it's a part of the conversation I have with leaders is, I really reinforce the notion that if you really want to be good at this work, you have to bring who you are fully and completely to the work because the work is hard. So if you have to put extra effort into being somebody else as well, not really sure that you're going to be able to find the joy that is really implicit in the journey. So
Yeah.
and again, it's living that example, right? So I still find that people are kind of fascinated, encouraged, and even the fact that I talk about my children, right? Like in every major interview I have done, I include the fact that I'm a mom and, you check the box and you pick me. You're going to pick me and the kids and the
Mm.
house and the dog and the husband and the whole thing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because, I'm that whole person and I don't leave that out, right? So, and I have had more than once where professional women have said, you know, really glad that you said something about that. Really glad that you talk about your kids. Really glad that you talk about, childcare pickup time because so that we have to make up other excuses in order
Yeah.
to be considered and taken seriously in the
Yeah.
workplace. So fortunately for me, I never have. And I've always worked with people who have valued that reality and
Yeah.
seen that reality as an asset to the assets that I bring,
Yeah.
not and then there's this other thing, right? So I've been fortunate that way.
Well, and something you said even when you were in that share was that you remembered when you were a teacher, remembered what it was like to feel like othered or
Right.
whatever. And I had a guest on recently who said the moment you as an educator forget what it felt like to be a kid, I think
Yeah.
you may have lost something.
Yeah.
And so I think holding on to those memories that may not have been so positive, but I remember what that's like.
Yeah.
How does that's such a that piece of empathy of that's who's sitting in our classrooms
That's
every
right.
day.
And
And you will notice things that I wouldn't notice as a white man. There's
well,
a woman, there's a
exactly.
girl who's straightening her. And I'm not saying that any Black woman who has their hair straightened means that she's trying to,
Right.
that's certainly not the case, but
Right.
you would have a better sense of, I wonder if that's somebody who needs encouragement in some ways to say, you can, but you don't have to do that. Like you
And
can be
you know
who you
what? And
are.
it shows up in a lot of different ways, right? Because again, when we show up in the fullness of who we are, people find what they need in us, right? So you don't have to say anything at all. So it's really remarkable that I'm at a place in my career now where, I go places and, I meet up with, well, now they're not even such young people. Sometimes they're middle-aged people who come up to me and say, you were my teacher, my principal, my vice principal, and so forth. And I remember when you said, and it's some small,
Yeah.
nondescript little item that for some reason it just stayed with somebody. And when you think about those kinds of things, that when you're in the role of a teacher, the influence that you have just by being you. So it's
Yes.
not to say that, I kind of go out there to try to, kind of influence people, or even with things that I notice. I may notice something and I may ask a question, but a lot of times it's for me to learn, not for me to influence, right? So it's
Right.
something that I've noticed that I didn't notice before or I didn't understand. And usually that starts a relationship that allows a reciprocal learning to happen, right? So, but coming into a classroom, the influence teachers have, the influence educators have is so incredibly powerful and long lasting that, it really, I have to put it as a burden of responsibility to know that my very presence in the classroom is teaching in and of itself just by me being there.
Yeah.
Right?
I
So I feel, I mean, it's been I mean, I know lots and lots of people have passed my way.
Mhm.
Just the other day, there was somebody who came up to me in the dollar store in Whitby and said, "You won't remember me, but," and and she's a parent in our community with three
Yeah.
children in our school.
As when you think of a teacher or somebody in education and the number of kids that
Yes,
you interact with, adults, and the things and the amount that you talk and say things, like,
yes,
when you say that, like, yes, there are those moments where someone says, you won't remember a thing you said. And normally when people do that, they're telling you something positive that you said that
yes,
you wouldn't remember,
yes,
but you go, oh, I said that, great.
yes,
But I also think about, man, because my kids will tell me things I've said negatively
right,
to them. They'll say, you said this to me like
yes,
10 years ago. And I'll go, I don't remember saying that.
yes,
So it's, yes, you can remember all the wonderful things you might have said, and but to your point, the power that you have
yes,
with every word you say. And so, you can't go through life worrying about, every little word. That's challenging, but to be mindful of the fact that the things you say and do will have an
and they
impact on
matter.
someone. You won't know it,
Yeah, they
and you
matter.
won't know it. So yeah. So tell me, I'm coming back to Durham here in a week, and I know a little bit about Durham, but I don't know a lot about Durham. When you think about Durham District School Board, what are you most proud of?
There's so many things. I looked at that question when you sent it and I thought, there's so many times, particularly now in my role as the director, because before I spent 7 years as a superintendent before I went away to Ottawa to be the director there. And then coming back as a director after 4 years being away, you really, in 4 years, you go away, you live a different experience, you come back and you see things you didn't see before. And it made me feel like a proud mama. And I know, and I'm careful about, using that because I don't want to sound paternalistic and I don't want to, sound presumptuous, but I do. I say to the team often, when you're in it, you don't realize that the gems that are a part of who we are. When I go into classrooms and I can see, I don't need anyone to tell me what kids are learning because I can see the learning happening, right? That is something that we might take for granted here, but it shouldn't be taken for granted. The level
Right.
of professionalism and commitment in classrooms, I'm particularly fascinated by kindergarten classrooms because, that's the beginning. I'm similarly, not equally, but similarly fascinated by grade 8 and grade 12 classrooms because it is where the transitions are happening of these people coming into people. So the energy of really giving our best to kids. And I am a person that believes that spaces are important. And I am very proud of the fact that as we go in, I go into schools a lot. So I try to get into at least 2 schools a week. As we go into schools and we go into spaces, we really have paid a lot of attention to maintaining spaces that are clean and orderly and well maintained because it speaks to the care for the young people who are coming into
That's right.
those spaces. It's funny that and this goes back to my days as a principal of, a school with a primary component. I tell the folks, I get excited when I see the primary classes and all of the little boots there, the toes are at the wall because it's when the shoes are in mayhem, it makes me very uncomfortable. And, I really feel like it's important for us to create orderly spaces for our young people because we know that spaces really inform mental health and well-being, right? Like when
Sure.
kids are sitting in chaos, it's hard for them to really kind of have that stability. So, and I'm proud of that. I'm proud of the fact that we do have, modern spaces that may have been old but are modernized and that we create those spaces and really look after those spaces for our kids.
That's interesting. I appreciate you saying that because it's one of these things that has, in the last, I don't know, whatever, 15 or 20 years, people have all of a sudden realized that maybe schools shouldn't just look like they did, right? There was no design considerations.
Right.
Like, just put them in a room, stick them in there, put some desks there, they'll be fine.
Yes.
Well, maybe not. So now we've got research and things that
Yeah.
say differently. But again, and I know, many schools and school boards are thinking about this, but the way you articulated that tells me that this is a little bit more systemic
Right.
at Durham than it is just, hey, if you're interested in design and space, go for it. But otherwise, you know, just the old way will just be fine
Yeah, and
kind
I
of
think
thing.
it's
So
not, it's certainly not to suggest that, we have palatial spaces. We are fortunate to be a growing board, and so we have, many modern schools because we have been blessed with the opportunity to be able to open schools. We were just up yesterday at a school in the north that had been reconstituted. There were two smaller schools that were demolished and rebuilt as a larger school, and it's beautiful because it's a modern build, right? So we have that opportunity here because we're growing so fast. But we also have schools that go back to
yeah,
1951, right? But
that's
even
right.
when you go into those schools, again, and every time I can give props to our custodial teams, I give it because I'm telling you, one of the things I discovered, it's a small thing, but if you're driving through and you're coming through Ajax on Bailey, we have our maintenance building there. And when I first came back, I went to visit at the maintenance building to visit, the teams that were working there. And one of the cohorts that is there are carpenters. And I didn't know we had carpenters. And so I went in and I met some of these folks, and they actually talked about how they worked with some of our special education facilitators to look at some of our students who have particularly unique needs, and some of those are physical needs, to build fit for purpose cabinetry so those students were able to be in a classroom and feel like there's a space for them. So our carpenters actually designed so that we were able, so we didn't have to send it out, we didn't have to do those things. We had, something out, and it's still up. This goes back years at one of our community centers in Ajax, where the region or the district partnered up with the region, and we had some funds that we were able to do a community project. And so the students, we had a whole group of grade 8 kids with an artist who made these beautiful images on plexiglass. And the carpentry students at Ajax High School built these huge, wonderful frames for all of these pieces, and they're installed as an image garden in one of our community centers. And that goes back, oh gosh, about 7, 8 years now. When I walk my beagle, I do pass through. And so those kinds of things speak to how we contribute to the spaces
Yeah,
in
yeah,
very, I want to say, clever and collaborative ways.
sure. Yeah, and just the fact that, you know, people aren't working in silos. They want to
Exactly.
support within one another like that.
Exactly.
There's a lot of sort of takeaways from that story,
Yeah.
I think that are worth sharing. So I like this question because I know it has people thinking back to a certain moment in time. When we talk about leadership challenges, like again, this job is filled with them all the time. Is there one that sort of sticks in your mind as being like, that was tough, or that really stretched me, or, just something that you kind of pull as your kind of, that was a big leadership challenge in my tenure?
So there have been many. I mean, I think that, each time you think you've got it conquered, then there's a new one in front of you, right? I think that, as leaders in Ontario today, we certainly struggle with competing priorities, and a lot of it is community priorities, right? Sometimes, and this is a part of one of the things that I struggle with, is the competing priority of creating well-being conditions as well as focusing on the core business of teaching literacy, numeracy, and learning, really, right? Because a lot of times those two conversations are situated as an or, and it's really difficult to help people to understand. And the way I put it is it's necessary but not sufficient, right? So, welcoming spaces, humanization of curriculum, well-being and mental health are necessary. They're not sufficient to preparing young people to enter a world where they're able to author their own lives. And so we need people to be critical thinkers, to be literate,
Yeah.
to be able to decipher and understand, to know when, these numbers are going to turn into these numbers, and to give themselves the opportunities to be independent people who are able to choose the path they want. So a lot of times people mistake when I say that as every kid should go to university, and that is certainly not what I'm saying. But when I look at how it is that any person is able to live independently with agency and being able to author their path. There's some skills that go with that, and we actually have to teach them, right? So this is
Well, that's about options, right? It's like you don't have to go, but if you wanted to,
well,
we are going to make sure that you have that option.
exactly. And so in order to have those options, you need to have the skills, right? And so those are I think that for me in this time is that conflicting nuance or apparently conflicting nuance that if we say one thing, it is
Right.
at the exception of the other. And I
That's
think
right.
it's really hard to get people to understand that they're integrally bound together. Kids who are frightened in a classroom are not going to learn. Kids who
Right.
feel unseen are not going to learn. But at the same time, love and warm tummies is not enough to ensure that,
Yeah.
our folks. And so it's that deliberate understanding of our core mission, which is ensuring that all of our kids have what they need to get across the stage in 14 years.
Well, I love that framing of necessary but not sufficient. And I think back to, and I had this conversation with Chris Kennedy, superintendent of West Vancouver, a number of times during COVID, is like, because everybody was like, all right, we just got to make sure kids are safe and well. Yes.
Right.
But how might learning contribute to their
To say
well-being? Like
yes.
that, because that's what people are saying. Well, teachers, like, let's not worry about the outcomes of learning. I don't know if you worry about them, but is there a way that we can say, but actually learning and being successful helps you feel well about
Yes.
yourself as opposed to just
Yes.
sitting in your own little,
Yes. Agree.
so I always appreciated that. And, he was always careful because like, I don't want to make this sound like I don't care about well-being,
Right.
but should we do both? But your framing of it, I think is a really helpful one. And my guess is that lots of leaders struggle with that because they maybe have a bias one way or the other, but you can't just lean into, because you can't just say, let's just do teaching and learning and forget about
Well,
well-being. All right.
exactly. Well, exactly. I think that's been tried, but it doesn't work.
Yeah. Yeah. So I love that one. So one more question about the leadership one. So I'm not sure I agree with what I used to believe not that long ago. And maybe it's true that there's a leadership crisis. In some respects, you could probably make the argument maybe that there is. I don't, but again, that's just a statement. I have no data to back that up. But when you're looking at upcoming leaders within Durham that you're saying like, listen, you have to have some sort of a contingency plan to say, as young as you look, Camille, I don't think you're going to be doing this job forever.
Oh, you're so kind.
Or should you? As well as all the superintendents and principals, like you need people to keep coming through this system.
Right.
So when you're looking at that newish 25-year-old teacher who's maybe either you've identified some leadership skills in them or they've acknowledged that they would like, well, like, what do you tell them about, like, how do you get from, a classroom teacher to a director, if that's indeed what you want to do or you could do?
So that's an interesting question because it certainly is not anything that I set my mind to at the beginning of my career. I wanted to be a teacher. And when people, ask me what I do now, I say I'm a teacher. That's what I say because that is what I am. And, I think that I made the comment about pay attention and show up, that sometimes opportunities present themselves and it's not every opportunity that you should jump at, right? Didn't pursue every job that showed up. I didn't pursue every directorship that showed up. I looked at things and thought, ooh, that looks intriguing. I'd like to try that. And then the next question is being prepared. So, when I do engage with folks who are developing their professional journey and they care to have a conversation about that, I often, and sometimes even if they don't care to have the conversation, I will still jump in with this. I will ask the question of, how are you prepared for the next step? Have you started your master's degree yet? When are you going to do your PhD? Have you done your supervisory officer qualification program? How's your principal's qualification coming along? Because I know I had the privilege and the opportunity to be able to pursue learning and preparation before I needed to use it for something. So I remember when I did the supervisory officer qualification program, it's a 4-module plus a practicum, not cheap, but it was something that was interesting and I was encouraged by a lot of people to do it. I thought I want to do it because it looks interesting, not because I want to become a superintendent tomorrow. And I
Right.
remember my husband, who is an IT guy with a lot of accounting background, said, "Well, when are we getting the return on this investment?" I said, "It could be a while. So, just slow your roll." But I think that a part of it is the joy of growth and the joy of being able to explore that there's not just one leadership path, that there are, I have colleagues who became leaders in the union. I have colleagues who become leaders in academia. I have colleagues who have chosen a variety of different paths. You are a great example of that. You are a leader in an area that is emerging in a very interesting way. And you couldn't have foreseen that 15 or 20 years ago. It's certainly not something you put on your vision board, So as things emerge and percolate, are you ready? Have you read? Have you taken the steps? And is it something you want? And so,
Yeah.
how do you decide? Is it something I want to jump into? Is it something I want to try? Is it a risk? Is it an opportunity? And then just go ahead and try. And, I say to people, you don't like it, you don't have to continue, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's also not necessarily the next natural step. There are lots of people who remain classroom teachers and are leaders, but they
Sure.
are leaders in a way that is not looked at the same way. They are magnificent in their classrooms and in their schools, and the influence they have on new and upcoming and the community that they serve, that they are in the place that fills their hearts and fills the community up. So I think it's a lot. It's a lot of things, right?
Well, one of my favorite quotes, if you will, is from a book called The 9 Lies About Work.
Yeah.
And the lie is that leadership is a thing.
Yeah.
It's like there's no way to sort of capsulize it, but the only way to measure leadership is followership. Do people
Yeah.
pay attention to what you're
Yeah.
doing? So to your point about the classroom teacher, great classroom teachers almost are naturally
Yeah.
leaders because other people say, I want to be like them.
Yeah.
Like they've got something going
Yeah.
on that appeals to me, right? And they may not consciously be thinking about it, but
They're
you're a
influential,
leader, you're an influencer.
right?
Like you're doing a thing that other people want to do. So, and your title's not going to get you there. So, that there's more to it. Well, last question I want to ask before we sort of get into the wrap up ones. And you kind of, what I liked about this one is you actually already kind of did this one because you talked about the Carpenters in Durham, which I love. So the idea of gratitude is something I always want to make sure that I highlight and emphasize and make sure that people speak to. But is there a person that you can think of in education? And of course you can. I know you could think of, the problem is you have too many.
Right.
I get it. A one. Just today you just get one pick. And so it could be a recent thing that just reminds you of, and listen, before you do that, I'm going to give you a shout out that you could give, but I'll give it for you. Is your assistant Dorothy is amazing. And I've had an opportunity, and I know you're grateful for her because you've actually told me that too.
Oh,
So
yes. Yeah. And so when you say in education, I think it's bigger than that. I think it's in my
yeah,
sphere,
yes,
but I
absolutely.
have to say, and I mean, it sounds really super corny, but I have to say that where I have had significant gratitude is my children. Because there are times that stuff's happening at work or stuff's happening in schools, and I'm trying to figure something out. And I will literally go and say, okay, so everybody's talking about this. Is that true? Does that really happen at school? Can you tell me about that? Because it gives an insight to understanding, the things that we're trying to make rules about or we think we understand. And it's really caused me to think we always have to go and we have to do a truth check, if you will, with kids because we think we know. And, high school for me was it's decades ago, right? And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
I think that's where I've really, and you've said your kids don't hold back either. If I ask them a question, they tell me the truth, right? And, when I say, can I wear this? No, put it back. Don't wear that. Right? Or if there's something that I'm trying to figure out and I thought I had it and I put it to one of them and they go, no, that's not how it is. Like you think I
Yeah.
was on a
Yeah.
call the other day and there was a question about the cell phones in schools and everything. And, one of the kids said, you know, there was a whole big announcement and everything, but it wasn't really new. Like, we always did that in our classrooms, and all my friends had that in their classrooms. So I don't really know what the big announcement was for,
Right.
right? And I thought, wow, from the mouths of babes, right?
Yes.
So,
Yeah. 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 Well, and I think what you're also highlighting in another way is when we talk about student voice, which is one of those things that I always want to know what people mean by
right.
student voice because it's, it sounds very good,
Yeah.
but what are you actually talking about? And I think I'm always interested. Like, I don't want to hear the sweet stories of the kid that has done all amazing. Not that I don't want to hear them, but yeah, we often choose kids who are successful and they're going to say the things we like them to say. But I really want to hear from the kids who say things that I don't really want you to say that, but I do need to hear
Yes.
that because that's the reality, right? So
Yeah.
you got
The
to create a
reality
culture to
check.
get there. And you have that with your own kids,
Yeah.
right? Like they will tell you. So you got that built-in little piece.
Yeah.
But anyway,
What's
yeah,
really
that's great.
funny,
All right.
is everybody's, oh, the director's here, the director's here. And the kids have no idea what a director does. So I
I don't care
remember
about
going
you.
and visiting a classroom. It was a grade 7 class. And of course, everybody's making a big deal. The director came and all of this. And these girls, surrounded, they were showing me their things and all of that. And one of them said, can I ask you something? I said, of course. She said, what do you do? Right. And so, I started to explain and I basically said, I can work 365 days and no 2 days are the same. All the things that are experienced in schools are a part of my job, but it was just, it's really, it brings you back to, a place of humble because they know what their principal does and they know what their teacher does and they know what their education assistant does in their classroom and their custodian. But everyone's making a big deal, but I don't actually know who you are.
What are we doing here? Yeah. Oh, I love it. All right. 3 quick questions. We'll get you out of here. What are you reading or listening to today for, I would say, more professional growth? But if it's personal, that's fine too. But I
So
kind of
I
like to see
have
where you're up
been reading a lot of Adam Grant stuff. So the last thing I read
Mhm.
was Hidden Potential, and I've used a lot of the citations around that, and I'm reading currently in the middle of Anne Lopez. She has a piece on decolonizing education. So, I much to my daughter's chagrin, I read with a pencil. And so, I have a conversation with the books. And so I'm having a conversation with that particular book right now. But my Adam Grant, I keep going back to that particular one. I've read some of his other stuff, but that particular one, Hidden Potential, I have an ongoing conversation with that book.
Good for you. Yeah, those are good. What do you watch? And I'm thinking more like sometimes it's just, I don't want to be a director of education
Yeah.
for a little while. I just want to be like a human, a mom, a wife, whatever, or just a person. What do you watch just for that? And listen, the trashier it is, the better in my mind. So don't be afraid. And again, I say trash. Everybody's version of
Yes.
trashy is a little different, but that's what I want to know.
So it's funny because I actually, when it comes to watching foolishness, I like 2 things. I like medical shows, the drama, like the Grey's Anatomy type stuff. But The Resident was one I just watched that series. But I'm starting to kind of get into Law and Order Toronto.
Oh
And
yeah,
my
yeah.
favorite go-to is Hudson and Rex. So because it's Rex, wins your heart. And I recently went to Newfoundland and I love to look at all of the things that I went there and I saw that.
Okay.
So those are the things that I watch when I want to.
Right. So that's why the Law of Order Toronto is because you're watching it both as the story, but I know where
Yeah,
they did that.
exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
that's
Yeah.
that's a fun play. All right, last question. So last time when I was out in and came to visit you in Whitby, my wife and I spent Sunday in Port Perry,
Right.
which was a
Oh,
lovely spot. Had
beautiful.
lunch there and it was all great. So I'm looking for one of those kind of lesser known spaces or places in your community that people should, because I know my wife's going to come back with me in August when we do some work in that area. And so I'm always I'm always obviously narrowing your focus. It may not be appealing that way, but what is that kind of lesser known place, restaurant-y place that people should check out in your community?
So Trail Hub in Uxbridge is beautiful. They have a great restaurant there. The property is gorgeous. They've got lots of trails for walks and it's wooded and it is up on a hill. And if you want
Nice.
to be down at the lake, we have some beautiful walkways. I know, and it took COVID to get us to discover some of these places, having
Yeah.
lived in Ajax for many years. And I said to my husband, why don't we know this place? But when you go right down to the lake, There's a beautiful walkway that goes to some of our larger parks. And, you can actually, from one point of the curvature on the beach on a clear day, you can actually see the CN Tower right from across the lake. So it's a lovely spot. And this place I haven't tried yet, but I saw it show up on one of my feeds. It's called La Kista, and it's in Vandermeers. And so it's a little coffee shop in a big garden center. And it looks so beautiful. And I haven't tried it yet. So I'm not really sure
It's on
the
your list, though.
recommendation will work, but it looks
Sure.
really intriguing.
Fantastic. Well, I like both of those recommendations, and I'm going to see if I can make that work. But listen, it's been a delight to get to know you a little bit more and spend time in your board and hear your story. So thank you for giving me time. I know you don't have a ton of it, but I also know you don't talk a lot about how busy you are because you just are. Everybody is.
Right.
We all know that. So
We're all doing stuff.
anyway, we're all doing stuff. Everybody's doing stuff. So anyway, well, again, thank you for your time so much, Camille, and I look forward to
That's a
more
pleasure. I
conversations.
can't wait to see you again, and I'll get my sketch notes together for you.
That'd be great.
All right, take good
Cheers.
care and have a wonderful long weekend.